The world that gave birth to Timoshka Ankudinov was one of brutal injustice, where a person's fate was determined not by their intellect or talent, but solely by the accident of birth. The 17th century in Muscovy was an era where social mobility was almost exclusively downward for the vast majority, and upward advancement was virtually non-existent for all but a select few. It was in this suffocating atmosphere, where every step outside the prescribed path threatened inevitable retribution, that one of the most audacious, and perhaps most tragic, pretenders in Russian history emerged. Our hero, Timoshka, was born sometime in the mid-17th century, and the circumstances of his early years remained shrouded in mystery, as befits a future phantom. However, one thing is certain: he was not born in royal chambers. Most likely, his cradle was a humble home in the provinces, perhaps even on one of the numerous monastic estates, as some sources claimed. This was a world where peasants were tied to the land, and townspeople to their settlements. A world where every piece of bread was earned through arduous labor, and the slightest transgression could lead to torture, exile, or death. In such an environment, where the future was predetermined from birth, a person with a sharp mind and restless energy, which Timoshka undoubtedly possessed, had no choice but to break free from these shackles. His early biography is not a story of a happy childhood, but a series of minor yet profound traumas that shaped his personality. If the meager, fragmented testimonies are to be believed, Timoshka, despite his low birth, managed to receive some education, possibly at a church parish. He learned to read and write, a privilege available to only a few at the time. This opened doors to a world forbidden to common people. But with this came the realization of his own insignificance in the eyes of those who ruled this world. Every humiliation, every rejection, every condescending glance from the powerful only fueled his burning desire to prove his worth. He witnessed deception, theft, and the rise of the undeserving, and a deep contempt for the false hierarchy evidently matured within him. Timoshka was not just ambitious, he was obsessed with the idea of overcoming. Perhaps it was then, in his youth, that he first felt that fateful blend of resentment and ambition that would become his driving force. He understood that he would never achieve what he desired by honest means, by the rules set for his social class. He saw how others, less capable but more noble, effortlessly obtained everything he could only dream of. This feeling of profound injustice was likely the first psychological trauma that destabilized his inner world. He didn't just want a better life. He craved retribution, recognition, and perhaps even revenge against those who kept him on the short leash of social status. The key moment, the point of no return, was evidently his escape from Muscovy. Sources indicate that he was either a runaway serf or a minor serviceman accused of some offense. Perhaps it was simple theft, involvement in a rebellion, or just insubordination. What matters is not the act itself, but its consequences. As a fugitive, Timoshka lost everything he had, even the humble place he occupied in society. He became a nobody, an outlaw, condemned to wandering in constant fear of capture. It was at this moment, when his past was utterly destroyed and his future seemed bleak, that a monstrous yet brilliant plan must have ripened in his mind. If he could no longer be Timoshka Ankudinov, a runaway serf or a provincial scribe, then why not become someone entirely different? Someone who stood above all laws, all rules, all social barriers. Someone whose origin could not be disputed because it was, in itself, the highest authority. He didn't just decide to deceive. He decided to rewrite his identity, erase the old, and create a new, grand one, impervious to the humiliations he had endured. This point of no return was not merely an escape from punishment, but an escape from himself, from what he perceived as his worthless and shameful destiny. He understood that the only way to survive, and moreover, to succeed in this world, was to become a part of it on entirely new terms, terms he would dictate himself. And for this, he needed not just a new identity, but a new, fabricated lineage capable of shaking the foundations of the state. He was no longer a victim of circumstances. He was becoming their creator, and his life, the most audacious of all mystifications. But for such a daring scheme as rewriting one's own identity and claiming a royal name to appear even remotely plausible, it required not just luck, but a world ready to accept falsehood as truth. Mid-17th century Muscovy was precisely such a world, fractured, tormented, on the verge of explosion. It was not merely a period of stagnation, but an era of deep systemic crisis that festered from within, creating ideal conditions for the most improbable adventures. The political climate of Muscovy in those years was woven from contradictions. On the one hand, the Tsarist power seemed to have strengthened after the time of troubles, but in reality, it remained fragile, constantly balancing between the ambitions of the boyars, the influence of the clergy, and the discontent of the people. The memory of the false Dmitrys, the Polish intervention, and the chaos and lawlessness was still too fresh. People remembered how easily foundations crumbled, how accidental figures ended up on the throne, and how quickly faith in a true sovereign could turn into widespread disillusionment. This constant, albeit latent, sense of instability and distrust of the existing government was a crucial factor. The economic situation only fueled the fire. Muscovy, a country with vast territories but a primitive economy, constantly waged exhausting wars with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Sweden, and the Ottoman Empire. These wars demanded colossal resources, which were squeezed from the population through unbearable taxes. The Salt Riot, the Copper Riot, these were just the tip of the iceberg of popular despair caused by fiscal oppression and official arbitrary rule. In 1649, the Ulozheny Code of Law was adopted, definitively tying peasants to the land, effectively turning them into rightless serfs. This decision, intended to stabilize the state system, in reality only exacerbated social tension, creating millions of dispossessed people, deprived of hope for the future. The social atmosphere was permeated with fear, superstition, and deep-seated hatred. Deception, corruption, and cruelty became the norm at all levels of government. The common person was absolutely defenseless against the arbitrary rule of voivodes, clerks, and landlords. In the absence of functioning social mobility, justice, or any prospects, despair matured in the hearts of millions. Yet deep within the popular consciousness lived an unwavering belief in a good Tsar capable of restoring justice, if only he knew of his people's suffering. This belief, paradoxically, made people vulnerable to anyone who dared to declare themselves a miraculously saved or true sovereign, capable of freeing them from the oppression of bad boyars. Thus, mid-17th century Muscovy was a huge, seething cauldron where political instability, economic collapse, and total social injustice created an ideal, fertile ground for any, even the most insane, mystifications. The people were ready to believe in a miracle, in a savior, in any alternative to their hopeless reality. And into this world, saturated with despair and hope, stepped Timoshka Ankudinov, carrying with him the most audacious lie the era could conceive. Barely having crossed the border of Muscovy, Timoshka Ankudinov did not wait for fate to play another cruel trick on him. He knew that in a world where he was nobody, the only chance to become someone was to rewrite his lineage, and to do so not just audaciously, but boldly and uncompromisingly. His plan was truly monstrous. He declared himself none other than Tsarevich Ivan Dmitrievich, the son of false Dmitry II and Marina Mnishek, the little raven, Voryanok, a forgotten figure in Muscovy, long believed to have been executed in infancy. This was not just a lie. It was an assault on the very statehood, an attempt to turn the entire dynastic logic of the Romanovs inside out. His first major scam involved creating a plausible legend. Timoshka understood that simply declaring, "I am the Tsarevich," was not enough. He needed a story full of drama and miraculous salvation, capable of convincing not only desperate peasants, but also cynical European monarchs. He recounted how he miraculously escaped execution, how he was swapped with another child, how he wandered through foreign lands, concealing his true origin, awaiting his hour. He learned manners, studied the intricacies of court etiquette, absorbed rumors and gossip about the Moscow court to make his stories sound convincing. He even, according to some reports, posed as a runaway monk or nobleman before daring to take on his boldest role. It was a multi-year audition in which he prepared himself for the leading role in his life. His first major appearance on the international stage occurred in the lands of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, a long-standing enemy of Muscovy and a traditional refuge for all sorts of adventurers and pretenders. It was here, in 1653, that Timoshka first openly declared his royal origin. He presented himself to the Polish-Lithuanian magnates, those who had long sought to undermine Moscow, and offered them a deal, their support in exchange for future territorial concessions and political privileges. He was not merely a beggar, He was a merchant of illusions, offering power and wealth to those willing to buy his lie. And Poland, torn by internal contradictions and eager to weaken its eastern neighbor, proved fertile ground for his claims. He exploited their enmity, their ambitions, their insatiable thirst for influence. Despite the skepticism of some, many Polish magnates, and then King Jan Kazimierz himself, saw Timoshka not as a true Tsarevich, but as a potent bargaining chip to pressure Moscow. Why delve into the details of dubious origin when a living asset capable of igniting a fire in the enemy's camp stood before you? Timoshka received not only refuge, but also financial support and the opportunity to form a small detachment of supporters from among runaway Russians, Cossacks, and European mercenaries. He didn't just sit idly by, he actively wove intrigues, dispatched charters calling for rebellion against Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, promising his supporters land, freedom, and justice. He became a living banner for all the discontented, for those who craved change but could not achieve it legally. His words, though false, resonated in the hearts of thousands of the dispossessed. However, his first attempt at a real invasion of Muscovy, undertaken in the same year, 1653, ended in complete failure. Having gathered a small detachment, Timoshka moved towards the borders, counting on mass support from the population, but his calculation proved wrong. The Moscow authorities were on alert, and the population, though exhausted, was not ready to immediately embrace another pretender. His detachments were dispersed, and he himself was forced to flee again, leaving behind only rumors and disappointment. This failure, however, did not break him. On the contrary, it only spurred his ambitions, forcing him to seek more powerful patrons and more sophisticated paths to the Moscow throne. He understood that for success, he needed not just a legend, but a real, powerful military and political resource capable of challenging Muscovy's entire state machine. And he was ready to make any deals, endure any humiliations, just to obtain that resource. After the defeat near Muscovy, Timoshka Ankudinov did not fall into despair. On the contrary, he coolly analyzed his mistakes, understanding that to achieve his goal, he would need not just luck, but a completely different, more sophisticated arsenal. His next game was not only about creating a legend, but also about masterfully exploiting human weaknesses, about a delicate interplay of psychology and calculation. At the core of his personal toolkit lay, first and foremost, a phenomenal ability to adapt and learn. He was like a chameleon, instantly changing colors to blend in with his surroundings, be it the court of a Polish magnate, a Cossack camp, or a merchant's shop. Every defeat, every setback became for him not a reason to retreat, but a valuable lesson. He observed, listened, absorbed information, analyzed errors, and ruthlessly discarded ineffective strategies. If a direct military assault failed, it meant he had to seek alternative routes, weave more subtle diplomatic networks. But analytical intelligence alone was not enough. Timoshka possessed that elusive charisma that allows one to lead people, even when propagating outright lies. He knew how to speak, to persuade, to paint vivid pictures in the listener's imagination of a future where his supporters would gain everything they dreamed of. This was not merely eloquence. It was the art of manipulating hopes and fears. He read people at first glance, unerringly identifying their pain points and secret desires. To Polish magnates, he was a valuable asset capable of destabilizing Muscovy, promising them lands and influence. To runaway Russians, Cossacks, and mercenaries, he was a banner of freedom, promising liberty, forgiveness of sins, and rich spoils. He knew which emotional chords to strike to evoke the desired response, be it the lust for profit, the desire for power, or a deeply ingrained resentment against Moscow's order. He sold not just a dream, but a concrete, tangible benefit. His influence tactics were strikingly modern for the 17th century. Timoshka didn't just utter empty words. He methodically built an aura of legitimacy and excitement around himself. He carefully selected his entourage, forming a kind of shadow government or expert council. These were not merely random companions, but people useful for his scheme. Impoverished nobles who knew court etiquette and genealogy, capable of confirming his royal origin and teaching him the intricacies of high society. Former monks or priests who could lend a religious aura to his claims and convince believers of his divine right. Experienced military men capable of commanding detachments and giving his enterprise the appearance of a serious force. Even minor merchants and spies who knew how to spread rumors create a significant public stir, and ensure logistics. These experts not only advised him, but also served as living witnesses to his royal origin, confirming his story, spreading myths about his miraculous salvation and true right, often for generous promises or simply out of their own deep self-interest. He used every channel available to him to create an information uproar. Letters and manifestos written in his name spread throughout Europe, reaching not only Polish, but also Swedish, Austrian, and Venetian courts. In these messages, he didn't just assert his rights, he skillfully played on the contradictions between European powers, offering them advantageous alliances against Muscovy. He understood that the more noise he made, the more influential people became interested in him, the harder it would be for the Moscow authorities to simply dismiss him as another madman. Every rumor, every intrigue, every mention of his name in European capitals worked to strengthen his, albeit false, reputation. But perhaps his most striking characteristic was his exceptional resilience and ability to regroup. After each failure, he did not give up, but merely changed direction. When Poland became too dangerous or unprofitable, he sought refuge in Sweden, then in the Ottoman Empire, and then in Venice. He did not tie himself to one place or one patron, always keeping several backup options in mind. He was a virtuoso of diplomatic tightrope walking, ready for any concession, just to keep his game going and continue moving towards his cherished goal. His personal will to power, to recognition, to revenge, was so strong that it allowed him to overcome any obstacles, transforming defeats into stepping stones to new, even more audacious adventures. He was not just a pretender. He was a living embodiment of an indomitable drive for self-realization, albeit built on the foundation of the most grandiose lies, on the ruthless exploitation of others' ambitions and despair. After the failure of his first attempt to invade Muscovy, Timoshka, with his characteristic tenacity, immediately shifted his attention from Poland to Sweden, seeing in it a new potential patron. In those years, in the mid-17th century, Sweden, under Queen Christina and then Charles X Gustav, was one of the dominant forces in Northern Europe, having just emerged victorious from the 30 Years' War. It pursued an aggressive expansionist policy, and Muscovy, with its rich northern territories and access to the Baltic, was of obvious interest to Stockholm. Timoshka offered the Swedes the same deal as the Poles, his person as a living battering ram to destabilize Muscovy in exchange for support. The Swedes, though cautious, saw in the Tsarevich a valuable tool for blackmail and a possible weakening of their eastern neighbor. They granted him asylum, unofficial financial aid, and allowed him to conduct intrigues, using him as a trump card in their geopolitical game. However, Sweden, preoccupied with its own wars and internal reforms, was not in a hurry to throw all its forces behind a dubious pretender. Timoshka could not afford to wait. His restless energy demanded constant movement, and he again changed course, turning his gaze south, towards the Ottoman Empire. This was a truly desperate, yet brilliant move. The Porte, under Sultan Mehmed IV and his powerful Grand Viziers, was an eternal enemy of the Christian world, and a traditional refuge for all who fled European justice or sought support against their rulers. For the Turks, eager to expand their influence in Eastern Europe and the Black Sea, the appearance of a Muscovite Tsarevich was a true gift. They harbored no illusions about his origins, but saw in him an ideal instrument for stirring up trouble in Muscovy, diverting its forces from the southern borders, and perhaps even obtaining territorial concessions. In Istanbul, Timoshka reached the peak of his influence outside Muscovy. He was received with honors, received significant financial support, and most importantly, official recognition as the true Tsarevich. The Sultan, in his characteristic manner, used him as a threat, a constant sword of Damocles over the head of the Muscovite Tsar. Under the Porte's protection, Timoshka continued to send out appeals, calling for rebellion, and even attempted to gather a new detachment of Zaporozhian Cossacks and Turkish mercenaries. This was the moment when his adventure took on a truly international, threatening character, transforming him from a runaway serf into a figure capable of influencing the geopolitical balance of power. But every ascent was inevitably followed by a fall. After several years in the Ottoman Empire, as his usefulness to the Porte began to wane, Timoshka again found himself in a position requiring a change of scenery. His next destination was the Venetian Republic, another power constantly balancing between powerful neighbors and eager to weaken them. The Venetians, embroiled in an exhausting war with the Ottoman Empire, saw Timoshka as a potential ally capable of distracting Turkish forces, or at least creating diplomatic pressure. They granted him asylum, but treated his claims with far greater caution than the Turks. To them, he was not a Tsarevich, but rather an interesting asset that could be used in negotiations, but nothing more. While Timoshka Ankudinov wandered through European courts, weaving intrigues and gathering supporters, his main antagonist, Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, sat on the throne in Muscovy. Alexei Mikhailovich was more than just a ruler. He was the living embodiment of stability and tradition. His Romanov dynasty had just survived the time of troubles and was striving with all its might to solidify its legitimacy. Known as the Quiet One, Alexei Mikhailovich was a devout and pious man, yet he possessed an iron will and the pragmatic mind of a statesman. For him, Timoshka Ankudinov was not merely an impostor, but a mortal threat, an open wound capable of reopening the memory of chaotic times and undermining the foundations of Tsarist rule. Moscow's reaction to Timoshka's activities was swift and uncompromising. Alexei Mikhailovich's court understood perfectly well that any impostor, no matter how ridiculous, could become a rallying point for the discontented. Therefore, the fight against Ankudinov was waged on all fronts. Diplomatic missions were dispatched to all European capitals, demanding the extradition of the fugitive serf and thief. Moscow's envoys spared no threats or promises, attempting to persuade foreign monarchs not to grant asylum to a state criminal. They provided detailed proof of his humble origins, disseminated his true name and identifying features, seeking to debunk his legend. Concurrently, an active counter-propaganda campaign was conducted within the country, where the populace was persuaded of the legitimacy of the Romanovs and the falsehood of any miraculously saved Tsarevich claimants. An extensive network of spies and informants tracked down Timoshka's supporters, and border services were put on high alert. For Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, Timoshka Ankudinov was not merely a minor nuisance, but an existential threat that needed to be eliminated at all costs before it could escalate into another time of troubles. His relentless pursuit of the impostor across Europe became a powerful demonstration of the Moscow throne's strength and resolve, showing that no enemy of